So in his introduction of this passage, N.T. Wright talks about smells and how some smells can just transport you back to a specific moment in your life. Perhaps it's the smell of the salt air near the ocean, or the smell of a certain perfume or fragrance, or perhaps it's the smell of something cooking over an open flame. We have these sorts of smells that take us back in time to these specific moments. And he says a way to look at the story that we're going to focus on today is through the lens of nostalgia and through the lens of smells, because where we find Peter denying Jesus is around a charcoal fire. And this isn't the only charcoal fire in the Gospel of John. It comes into play much later as well. Stick around, we'll talk about it. We're here to study the Bible. We're here to study the Bible. We're here to study the Bible. Might get us in trouble, cause we're being intentionally provocative with our intros. So just to bring us up to speed, Jesus has been betrayed by Judas. He has been handed over to the Roman official guard, perhaps numbering up to 600 of them, which seems really insane for a non-violent Jewish rabbi, more or less. He's also been taken into custody, if you will, by the Jewish temple police, taking him to the high priest. And this was all instigated, remember, by Judas, one of Jesus's own followers, one of his closest 12, that hands Jesus over and betrays him. And now we see Jesus going to the house of the high priest. It's interesting because there's actually two that are listed in this passage. We have Annas, who most scholars would say had been ousted of his duties as the high priest. But according to Jewish law, a high priest is a high priest for life. So Annas, while not being deemed a powerful entity by the Roman officials, was still sort of in this sphere of influence. So Jesus goes to talk to Annas, and then Annas hands him over to Caiaphas, who, as the author of John tells us, was the ruling high priest in that time. So Jesus speaks to both of these men to see what would become of him, and following him, we have Peter and another disciple. People love the ambiguity of the other disciple, wondering who it might be. Some people posit that it is the author of this book. It is the disciple whom Jesus loved. But it's really difficult to tell. The only thing that we know in this particular story is that the other disciple has a relationship with the high priest. Unsure if that's Annas or Caiaphas, but either way, that credential allows both Peter and the other disciple to enter into the courtyard of the high priest to sort of follow along and see what is about to unfold. It says Simon Peter and another disciple, they followed Jesus. And since that disciple was known to the high priest, he went with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest, whereas Peter was standing outside at the gate. So the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, the author is really wanting us to see that this is important. He goes out and speaks to the woman who guarded the gate, the porter, if you will, who was a woman who was basically taking credentials and saying, you can come in or you can't come in. The woman says to Peter, "You are not also one of this man's disciples, are you?" ? And Peter says, "Uk eimi, I am not." This is a beautiful way of framing this in the Gospel of John, because in the very passage preceding this, remember, the guards show up to the garden and they say, "Who is Jesus of Nazareth?" or "Are you Jesus of Nazareth?" I forget what they actually say, but Jesus' response is, "Ego eimi, I am," which, remember, all of the symbolic ties back to these Old Testament texts where God says, "I am who I am." And now Jesus is saying, "I am, ego, eimi, and it is a loaded theological statement, so much so that everyone that was there falls to the ground when he utters the words. And they have to repeat the whole frame again. Who is Jesus of Nazareth? Or are you Jesus of Nazareth? I am. I've already told you that. And there's this really crazy thing where the author is saying there's divine happenings here. Jesus is the Son of God, and he is making claims back to the Old Testament. Now remember, this is shaped history. So it's unclear if this is how the story actually pans out or if this is how the author of the Gospel of John wants it to pan out for his theological purposes. But either way, I am versus Peter, I am not. It is a very, very clear clashing of these two because Jesus is the faithful one. Jesus is the truth-telling one. Jesus is the one who stands before the high priest and tells him the truth. And Peter is the one who stands around a charcoal fire and lies to the porter and lies to the temple police and lies to everyone around about his relationship with Jesus. Now, I think this is important because we can tie this back to that charcoal fire, right, that N.T. Wright is talking about. And these remembrances, because there's another charcoal fire in the Gospel of John. It shows up in the later chapters of the book. I forget if it's in chapter 20 or 21, but it's at the end of the story. And Jesus is on the beach and he's cooking fish over a charcoal fire. And perhaps as Peter shows up, he starts remembering all of these things in his life where the last time he was there, he was saying, I am not a follower of Jesus. And in this story where Jesus is cooking fish over the open flame of a charcoal fire, he says, Peter, do you love me? Yes, I love you, I love you. Peter, do you love me? Yes, I love you, I love you, I love you. Peter, do you love me? Yes, I love you. And we have this threefold denial in John 18 and this threefold affirmation. Which I was thinking about this. In most of our lives, if you have a moment of complete failure, if you have a moment where something ridiculous happens to you, this is going to be a weird story, but I'll tell it anyway. When I was in 5th grade, I was sitting next to a student, a classmate of mine, and I kind of saw something strange happening out of the corner of my eye, so I looked over, and she's picking a scab. And I thought, oh gosh, that's kind of gross. And I look over again, and I see her sort of out of the corners of her eye, look around, look at the scab, and then she did exactly what you're thinking she did. And that's something that she never was able to let down, because in our small private Christian school, these are the sort of things that define you. And that's how it works when we have these ridiculous moments, and that one's silly, that's kid stuff, but if we have these big failures, that's sort of how people know us. Even in the Bible, Judas is the one who betrays Jesus. That's his story, that's his legacy. But Peter, who denies Jesus. In fact, I got to throw this in because in the Gospel of Mark, on the third denial, which Jesus had predicted, Mark is the only one that includes the detail that Jesus looks over and sees Peter and locks eyes with him, and Peter just breaks down and weeps. But in the Gospel of John, we have this story of Peter's failure. But that's not how he's defined. Peter goes on to be restored by Jesus. Peter goes on to become one of the founding members of the church. Peter goes on to do great things. And Peter was able to right the ship because he has this experience with Jesus. Perhaps what we need to hear in this video is whatever has defined you in the past, whatever has been your colossal failure that you feel is something that you cannot get beyond, you can. And through the power of the Spirit healing and motivating and moving, There's another phase to your story that you need to begin to walk toward. Now, there's a lot of things that we could say about this passage. I want to focus on this denial of Jesus by Peter and then his restoration in the latter chapters of John, because his story doesn't end there and yours doesn't have to either. Perhaps there are these smells or these memories of this moment. They can be overcome. We can move beyond the failure to the empowerment and the task at hand that Jesus is offering to us, namely to follow him and to love everything and everyone in your sight.